and welcome to this episode of the My Go-To Doc live stream. This week we're going to be talking about gluten, and gluten is one of those quite controversial topics, almost like dairy last week, but maybe even more so. Because so many, foods are centered around gluten, especially ones that people really like pasta and bread. So we're going to speak a little bit about the history of grains and gluten in particular, the gluten intolerance, celiac disease, and how to choose different options depending on your tolerance to gluten. So to start with, I want to explain a little bit about what gluten actually is. So it's a protein in the wheat. And as you can see here from this anatomy of a grain, there is the bran, which is the outer coating of the grain. And then there's the endosperm, which is inside, and the wheat and the germ. So gluten is actually a protein that's within the endosperm. And when we have whole grain bread so when you see whole grain wheat products, that's this on the left. So the bran is the outer shell, and it's filled with B vitamins, minerals, and different fiber. And then there's the endosperm and the germ. So the whole grain uses the whole grain. And basically grinds it up. And that's why the whole grain bread is brown and the refined white bread is really white and has a different texture to it. So that's the main difference between those. And we also have grains that are naturally gluten-free. So you can see here quinoa, amaranth, buckwheat, sorghum, rice, millet, teff, corn, and oats. All of these grains are naturally gluten-free. And then these other grains below, farro, bulgur, durum, rye, barley, spelt, camu, semolina, these all contain gluten. And in varying amounts, actually. Some have different amounts of gluten than others, but they all contain gluten. So celiac disease is the disorder that people think of most commonly when they think of gluten intolerance or gluten allergies. And it was actually initially described in the 1st century by a Greek physician named Aretaeus. And he didn't know it was actually an autoimmune reaction to gluten. That didn't become clear until the 1950s. However, he had some idea that it was related to bread and related to gluten. And the discovery of actually that this was a real condition saved many people, of course, because celiac disease, as we know, is really serious, and left untreated, it leads to malnutrition and stunted growth and lots of other chronic diseases. However, there is, aside from celiac disease, there are different types of what's called non-celiac gluten intolerance. And this is kind of a less common, especially in the Western medicine sphere. The idea of non-celiac gluten intolerance is not kind of widely accepted, and a lot of people still dismiss it and say that, oh, unless you're celiac, then you should have no issue with gluten, and this just isn't true. So I'm going to read just this. This is a little bit dense in terms of, understanding what the difference between celiac and non-gluten sensitivity is, non-celiac gluten sensitivity. But this is a really important aspect to understand if you want to be diagnosed with non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So wheat contains different classes of proteins. Gliadins and glutenins are the two main components of the gluten fraction. So they're essential for the stickiness that we get and the ability for bread to rise during baking. So within the gliadin class, there are 4 different epitopes. So alpha, beta, gamma, omega, gliadin. So, and wheat also contains agglutinins. So those are proteins that bind to sugar, and prodimorphins, which are proteins involved with cellular communication. So once wheat is consumed, the enzymes in the digestive tract, called transglutaminases, they break down the wheat compound, and in this process, additional proteins are formed, and these proteins are called, including D-mediated gliadin and gliadorphins. So the important thing to understand is that celiac disease is characterized by an immune response to a specific epitope of gliadin, so alpha gliadin, and a specific type of transglutaminase. However, we know that people can and do react to other components of the wheat and the gluten, including other epitopes of gliadin and also other types of demediated gliadin, as well as other types of transglutaminase. Um, so hopefully, oh, and this is important, including three types. So primarily found in the skin and primarily found in the brain, which is why non-celiac gluten sensitivity affects our skin and affects our brain often more than our digestive tract, which is what you mainly associate with gluten intolerance. So here, this might make a bit more sense if we see this. So here are the gluten proteins that they test for when they test for celiac disease, the alpha gliadin, and here the specific type of enzyme at the bottom that you'll see. Um, and unless that comes up on the test, then you might be considered fine, that you don't have any issues with gluten. But it can be the case that there are all of these components that you'll see, that you can be tested for, these other types of proteins and enzymes that might signify non-gluten sensitivity. So this is actually it's a lab called Cyrex Lab. And Cyrex Lab have a panel that you can do, and you can test for these different types of non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So if you have an idea that might be the case, this is a good avenue to go down. So non-celiac gluten sensitivity is actually a lot more common than we think. Up to 1 in 10 people suffer from it. And the symptoms are often, as I said, non-digestive. And this is an issue because people associate issues with eating bread or gluten as, they think that, oh, if I eat this and I'm not bloated and I don't have digestive issues, then I must be fine, without realizing that, anemia, fatigue, brain fog, headaches, eczema, dermatitis, depression, and anxiety. So in particular, as we spoke about, it's skin and neurological related, those symptoms are actually much more common in the case of non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Um, so this is an excerpt from an ebook by Chris Kresser on this subject. So another issue is the main variety of symptoms caused by celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So most people assume that gluten intolerance always causes digestive stress, and this is not the case. So many physicians and patients only suspect and therefore test for gluten intolerance when digestive symptoms are present. However, both gluten intolerance and celiac can be present without any gut symptoms and only extra intestinal symptoms. So this is really important to bear in mind if you have any of these skin and brain fog and depression related concerns separate to digestive concerns. Okay, so here are some examples of chronic conditions that can result in the long term from untreated non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So as you can see, it's definitely something that, if you have an idea that you could be suffering from this, to inquire further about it. So this is just quickly in the context of long COVID. So non-celiac gluten sensitivity involves the immune system and damage to intestinal lining. There is some kind of conflated symptoms with long COVID. So long COVID also causes brain fog and intestinal issues. So people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity could be more susceptible to having long COVID, and also just having the volume turned up on the symptoms that they might have already been experiencing prior to the infection. Um, yeah, so this is really we spoke about the very specific reaction that we're having when it comes to the proteins in wheat. Um, but there's also another facet to the story, which is talking about the evolution of wheat. Um, and, as with healing from any kind of condition and deciding, should I eat this food? Will this food be a part of a healing diet for me? There's usually two main questions that I always pose to people, and the first question is, how did this food come into being? Was it a whole food? Was it made in a factory? How did it grow? What kind of conditions did it grow in? And then the second thing is, how do I react bio individually to this food? So in the first part of the presentation, I was focusing more on how do you find out if you bio-individually react badly to gluten. But then there is also the subject of how is it actually grown? And as you can see here, most basically all wheat at some point in 10,000 to 9,000 BC was basically wild wheat, was einkorn. Um, and gradually, different types of wheat like spelt and durum and camu, like they evolved, and that's kind of what we're seeing today. But those grains are actually very different to the grains that we originally would have eaten, in terms of the amount of gluten and just in terms of the bran and in terms of the structure of the wheat. Aside from, the actual type of um, wheat itself, there's also this idea of the GMO. So this is a kind of this is basically a timeline to talk about when things like breeding, introgression of breeding, also GMOs. In 2013, we had the addition of CRISPR, which is basically a gene editing tool that would be able to change the and adapt the genes of the wheat plant. So really from this period in the 1700s onwards, there's a huge evolution of how wheat is actually processed, how it's been bred, um, and Michael Pollan actually has a great section in his book Cooked, where he talks about the history from a political point of view, from an economic point of view, and he talks about the history of wheat and essentially how we ended up with this specific plant, which is grown for maximum yield. It's grown it's actually grown to suit the machines that process and break down wheat really well. It's hyper industrialized to be efficient and to create the most output. So it's very different to this einkorn that you saw from now 9,000 in the previous slide, from 9,000 BC. And I think one argument that a lot of people make when they talk about when they're adverse to the idea of, let's say, avoiding gluten, they will say, oh, we've been eating bread through the whole history of humankind, and how could it possibly be bad now? And I think the answer to that is that we're just not eating the same type of grains that we were at that time. And this evolution that you'll see in this chart is actually a relatively fast evolution in the context of human evolution, and we're just not adapted and ready for that. So this is an example again of just how wheat is processed. So there's a lot of, you can, we don't have to go through every single point, but it's basically a very highly industrialized process that's very different to how we would have made bread originally, which is with a sourdough starter. So here is an example of how sourdough starters are made, which is very different to how industrial bread is made, which is through the use of yeast, but instant yeast. That I'm sure if anyone's familiar with baking, you know what instant yeast or instant leavening does. But the majority of bread that was made through the history of humankind was made in this specific way with sourdough. So bacteria from the environment, flour, which is the sugar and starch that feeds bacteria, and the yeast, which is basically what produces the carbon dioxide, and that's what creates the holes and the rising of the bread, essentially. And the thing about sourdough is that when you're making a sourdough starter, like you see here on the left, it's a form of fermentation. In the way that we people make beer or ferments such as kombucha or ferments such as sauerkraut and fermented vegetables, and it's actually a process of harnessing bacteria and yeast in order to break something down. And it's almost like you can think of it as a second stomach. It's doing this work to break down the grains in a certain way, and the byproduct of that is these aromas and the CO2 that we get that helps leaven bread, and the smell and the acidity of sourdough all comes from this kind of breakdown process. And the good thing about this process is that it helps you digest the food more easily because it sort of is an external stomach. So by the time you eat a sourdough bread, part of the digestion has already been done by these bacteria and by these yeast, and your job of digesting is less difficult. And, in the case of this hyper industrialized wheat that we talk about, or bread, that's not the case at all. It's really a lot of work for your body to digest that. And a lot of times the bran, the fiber, the minerals, all of those things have been stripped away. So it's really just the endosperm and the most processed high glycemic part of the wheat that's actually used to make bread. And this is a completely different bread to this, what you see on the right here. So a lot of people's answer to, this issue with gluten is, of course, going gluten free. And the gluten free industry is massive, and it's become a trend, and a lot of people advocate for it without even sort of realizing what it means. And I think, one important thing to note is that, this industry this whole gluten-free movement is susceptible to the same kind of trends and industrialization as, the industry that we're criticizing of hyper-processed wheat. It can be hyper-processed but gluten-free grains. And often what we'll see in this case is, additives such as sunflower oil, industrial seed oil, sugar. Here you can see different types of sugar that are added. Xanthan gum, which is basically a stabilizer that can be really gut irritating and cause gut inflammation. So if you are going to choose gluten-free products, you have to be really careful with reading the ingredients and try to choose ones that just contain whole foods. So it should be one of the gluten-free grains that I mentioned, maybe apple cider vinegar and water and salt, and that's it really. As soon as you start having these kind of long ingredients lists that you see here, that's a red flag. And it can just be this thing of, going from the frying pan into the fire, and you're avoiding gluten, but you're creating some other problems by choosing these hyper processed gluten-free products. I think a better kind of approach to it is to think of gluten and bread as a kind of a condiment or a side dish. It shouldn't be that the bread and the gluten and the pasta and all of that is the center of the meal. It should just be a side aspect of it. So this is another kind of way to approach looking at consuming grains and gluten. Um, so yeah, I think this is it really, in terms of this is a very quick history of both the history of the grains and how they react in your body. But again, just to summarize, those two are really the main things that main questions we should be asking ourselves when we decide, should I eat this? It's is my body going to react to this? And how did this come into the world? Like, how did it grow, and was that healthy, and is that nourishing for me and for the planet and this whole package? So that is it. And thank you for listening. Um, yeah, if anyone is interested in joining our group coaching program, which we run um, every single week, we basically go over the content from the group coaching program, and then everyone has a chance to speak and ask questions, and we have some really interesting people in the group, and yeah, some great discussions in regards to long COVID, but also outside of that. So I'm going to answer, okay, some of your questions. So how can we distinguish gluten sensitivity from candida? Well, okay, so these are two totally different things. So gluten sensitivity can be characterized by some of those things I spoke about. So things like the brain fog, skin issues, dermatitis, eczema. Sometimes it can also be gut health and intestinal issues. Candida is, similar types of symptoms. You can also have brain fog. You can also have skin issues, although they look slightly different. I think candida type skin infections have a specific look to them that a dermatologist would be able to diagnose. But the main thing is in the testing. If you do a candida test, you can do it either by blood, or depending on, they can take a sample from the skin or the air or the mouth or wherever the candida is present. A stool test is possible for a candida, something like a GI stool map. And blood tests are also a way to determine, although if you have an antibody to candida, it might not necessarily mean that you have, it could just be that you had a past infection rather than you have a current infection. So it has to be specifically to that. So those tests that I mentioned, the blood, the stool, and the skin swabs, those are completely different to this Cyrex lab test that I showed I think it was in the third slide, where they basically determine your reaction to different types of proteins and gluten. Um, so can you be gluten sensitive but eat wheat? My friend is gluten sensitive but not celiac. I was eating Cheez-It crackers. Um, she said, I'm gluten sensitive or not celiac. What does that mean? So this is sort of what I was speaking about, in the presentation. So you can have what's called non-gluten celiac sensitivity. And I'm going to go back to the slide just because maybe this was missed, but let me go back to this. So basically, this slide shows the different types of proteins and enzymes that you can react to that are different to the celiac. So anti-gliadin, and this one in the middle, the very center. So those are the ones that you'll be tested for if you have celiac disease. But as you can see, there are many more gliadins, and there are many more components of the gluten's structure that can also trigger non-gluten sensitivity. But I would say, the thing about these type of tests is that when you have this test and you find out, okay, I have a reaction to this specific type of protein in the wheat, it doesn't mean necessarily that you'll have that for life. It can often just mean that your intestinal health has been compromised for many reasons. In the same, last week we talked about this in the context of dairy, but if you have, gut health issues, that are triggered by things like overuse of pharmaceuticals or stress or eating, processed foods when you're a child, or any of these things, and your gut health is compromised, that will leave you more predisposed for non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And then when you actually have a chance to work on your gut health, it could be that the sensitivity goes away. And this actually happens with a lot of people. And this is sort of the aim, I would say. It's not to just kind of find out that you have this issue and then think that, oh, this is going to be me for life. This is just an indication that your gut health is not optimal. And if you work on it over years, it could be that you can have small amounts of gluten again and be absolutely fine. So this is important to bear in mind. So can gluten sensitivity cause joint pain? Yes, definitely. Um, this is another common symptom that people have, that's non-digestive symptom. So it's also, if you don't want to go for a Cyrex lab test, you can also do an elimination diet to try to find out if you are reacting to gluten, and you can just eliminate all gluten for 30 days and then introduce something like a bread 3 times a day, like 3 pieces of bread in the day, or like a bigger type of introduction after the 30-day period, and then watch for 24 to 48 hours to see what kind of symptoms arise. And elimination diets, I would say, are really accurate and useful. And if you don't want to or can't afford to do a lab test, it's a good road to go down. So do you have a recipe for gluten-free bread? Yes, I can share. I have quite a few recipes, and also brands actually that sell gluten-free bread that doesn't have all of these other additives. So I'll share those in the show notes also, so people can check that out. And I think I also have a good gluten-free sourdough recipe, although that's slightly more tricky to make, but it's also quite interesting and tasty. So I think that's it for the questions. Um, Yeah. So thank you everyone for coming on. And yeah, so here is the QR code if you want to find out more about the Phoenix protocol, the program that we're doing for long COVID recovery. You can scan this code and read more about it. And we join every week. We meet every week on Fridays at 1 p.m. EST time to discuss the content, and to basically answer any questions that people have about their individualized journey. So thank you for listening, and hope to see you again next week. Bye.